Do you like being listened to? I know I do. At least 3 of you on my last video said you wanted this video, after I mentioned China's genocide of the Uyghurs having ancient roots. To understand why the Chinese communist regime would do something so evil, you must understand the history of these two peoples, and how the Uyghurs have nearly destroyed China twice, as well as weakening the Qing dynasty in the 19th century. My name is Benjamin Angwin. In recent years, the anti-West left has focused on Israel, with slanders of, in quote, genocide. But in a genocide, the population goes down, not up, as it has with the Arabs in the land. And it struck me, why is the anti-West left so silent on actual genocides in China and Africa? The answer is that they both have complex ancient histories which require more thinking than just blame the Jews to attack the West. And the ancient roots of the Uyghur and Chinese issue is worth a video here, so let's get into it. During the Tang dynasty from 618 to 907, which was both a golden age in Chinese history, in parts, as well as an expansionist phase, seeking a Central Asian empire along the trade routes, the tension and conflict between the Han Chinese and the Uyghurs came from the An Lushan rebellion from 755 to 763, a catastrophic civil war that nearly brought down the Tang dynasty by bringing in peoples further west and north, like the Uyghurs, into the fighting. Desperate to survive, the Emperor Suzong of Tang, ruling from 753 to 763, turned to the power of the Uyghur Khaganate in the northwest for military aid. The Uyghurs saved the dynasty, but at a cost. They exacted a humiliating deal which the Chinese begrudged for over a century when the Uyghur cavalry helped take back the main capitals of Chang'an and Luoyang from the rebels. They demanded the right to plunder. They brutally looted Luoyang, slaughtering thousands of innocent folk and burning the city. For decades after the rebellion, the Uyghurs used their status as China's saviors to force a lopsided trade agreement. They forced the Tang court to buy their old haggard horses in exchange for caravan loads of premium Chinese silk. I like silk. This drained the Tang treasury and plunged the Chinese economy into debt, from which the Tang dynasty never truly recovered. Because they were such a battlefield force, Uyghur merchants and envoys living in the capital of Chang'an acted with legal impunity. They flouted Tang laws, engaged in street violence, and openly insulted locals and local officials, even knowing the emperor was too weak due to financial strains to punish them. Another strain at that time was in faith. Uyghur elites converted to Manichaeism, a dualistic religion from the Middle East, completely different from anything in the east of Asia, and forced the Tang court to allow the building of Manichaean temples inside China, offending traditional Chinese Confucian sensibilities. This would happen again later on, by the way, when Uyghurs converted to Islam and tried to impose that in areas on Chinese society. History went on, however, and over the 8th century the Tibetan Empire pushed north, taking over the Tarim Basin and fortresses along the Silk Road, weakening the Uyghur Khaganate. Under pressure, the Uyghur Khaganate suffered internal conflict and then an invasion by the Kyrgyz, who would later on in history form Kyrgyzstan. I don't know if I pronounced the name of their country that well, but in the year 840, pushing the Uyghurs to the brink, the Tang dynasty saw their chance and took revenge, launching military campaigns into Uyghur lands, breaking up the remaining Uyghur refugees, banning their Manichaean religion inside China. The Khaganate fell, but the upper class of the Uyghur people survived By using their intellectual, learned studies, they were educated as a people to serve the Tang dynasty and to govern local cities, peace in exchange for local rule. Centuries after their empire fell, the Uyghurs thrived in the oasis cities of the Silk Road. Cities such as Gaochang, as sophisticated, literate merchants, as I said, governing on behalf of the empire. Though they were semi-independent, sort of their own kingdom, sort of not. Kind of pay us taxes, we'll let you be kind of thing. When Genghis Khan began unifying the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian plateau in the early 13th century, the Mongols had a big problem on their hands. They had no written language. To run an empire, you need to collect taxes, keep censuses, keep records of bad guys, and issue laws for your people. He could not turn to the Chinese as administrators. They would swallow his country. They were too prestigious. In the Uyghurs, he found his answer. In the year 1204, Genghis Khan defeated a tribe called the Naimans and took captive a talented Uyghur scholar named Tata Tanga. Sounds like saying goodbye to the island of Tonga. Tata Tonga. Rather than killing Mr. Tata Tonga, Genghis Khan was clever enough to see the value of Tata Tonga's literacy and ordered him to adapt the old Uyghur script to the spoken Mongolian language, to turn Mongolian into an imperial language. I mean, I guess if he's going to exchange that for saving your life, not a bad deal. This script came from the Aramaic of the Middle East, the Levant, through trade routes into the Silk Road, and then entered into the Sogdian script, and then into the Old Uyghur script, captured by Genghis Khan in 1204. The Uyghurs had borrowed their script from the Sogdians, an Iranian merchant people west of the Tian Shan Mountains. In Chinese, Tian means heaven or sky. Shan means mountain, so heavenly mountains, or mountains of heaven. The Sogdians' alphabet ran horizontally from right to left. However, the Uyghurs rotated the script counterclockwise, so that it would read in columns, mimicking the prestige of Chinese characters with an alphabet. Traditional Mongolian remains one of the only vertical scripts in the world written this way, still in use. Not characters, but a vertical alphabet. This foreign vertical alphabet, fusing Uyghur script with Mongolian language, became the bureaucracy that ruled over the Chinese. So, when the Mongols swept south and conquered the Chinese Song dynasty, establishing the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan, which ruled China from 1271 to 1368, they did not trust the Han Chinese to run the government of the land they had conquered. I mean, why would you let those you defeated in war rule the lands you now rule? Instead, the Mongols relied on the Uyghurs, using them as their elite civil servants, tax collectors and scribes. The government, after all, these Uyghurs could read and the Mongols couldn't. Decrees from the Mongol Khans ruling over China were stamped with the imperial seal and written using the Uyghur script. For the native Chinese, this was both ironic and historically painful that these desert barbarians were their government administrators. Long after the Yuan dynasty had gone, when the Qing dynasty conquered the Tarim Basin and Dzungaria in the 1750s, it wasn't really about the Uyghurs at all. The Qianlong Emperor's real target was the Dzungar Khanate, a rival Mongol power that had challenged Qing authority for decades. Remember, when the Mongol Horde broke up, There were several kingdoms across Central Asia related to each other. The campaign against the Dzungars was a genocide in its own right, mass killing that emptied much of northern Xinjiang in the far west north of China, northwest. The Uyghur oasis cities of the Tarim Basin, which ran in an arc along the Silk Road, were absorbed almost as an afterthought, swept up in the wreckage of someone else's war. The Uyghurs were just in between, really. And the Silk Road is important with the Uyghurs and Han Chinese before and after this. Several Chinese empires have tried to expand toward the Caspian Sea to control Central Asia. But to do that, you must hold this desert area around the Tarim Basin where the Uyghurs are. And so when Xi Jinping, today, builds a new Silk Road and a series of fortresses along this desert arc, whilst forcefully removing Uyghurs, he's echoing emperors of the past who sought to use Uyghur lands as a gateway, the only way through the mountains, to rule over Western Asia and beyond. Xi Jinping is not that original, he's just following what Chinese history has done before. Going back to Jungaria, for over a century after its conquest, Qing rule here was very light. The region didn't even have the name we know it by today. It was only in 1884 that the Qing formally organized it as a province and gave it the name Xinjiang, literally new territory or reclaimed new frontier, because the Chinese had it. They conquered it back or reconquered it. Before that, administration had run through local Uyghur elites called begs, overseen loosely by a governor. Religion, language, and local law were largely left alone. Pay us money and do your own thing. Tax income. This is worth highlighting as it cuts against the grain of how many outsiders will see this. This wasn't 100 years of assimilation and control. It was 100 years of the Qing, ruling from a distance and letting Uyghur society largely run itself. However, that broke down in the 1860s and 70s at the same time as Muslims in South China tried to create a sultanate through armed revolution. See my video on the Panthay Rebellion. However, the Dungan Revolt of 1862 brought Muslim uprisings across northwest China, and in Xinjiang itself, a warlord named Yaqub Beg carved out an independent Uyghur state centered on Kashgar, lasting for a decade. Uyghurs ruled themselves and gave aid to Muslim revolts in Gansu and Yunnan. It took a Qing general, Zhuozong Tang, running one of the most logistically difficult wars in Qing history, or Chinese history, for that matter, caravans across the desert, to bring the region back under Beijing's control in 1877. And here's where the story connects to something much bigger. Whilst Zhuo's armies were fighting their way across the Tarim Basin, the Qing Empire was also watching its northeastern border collapse in slow motion. Russia had forced the Treaty of Aigun in 1858 and the Convention of Peking in 1860, taking China's northeastern coast into Russia, land neither the Qing nor China itself would ever get back. And Russia did not stop there. In 1871, whilst Yaqub Beg still held Kashgaria, Russian troops occupied the Ili Valley in Xinjiang, exploiting the chaos of the rebellion against China to grab a bit of land. The Qing spent years of negotiating and threatening war just to get Ili back, at last doing so with the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1881. So for 2 decades, the Qing were fighting a two-front problem against the Russian Empire. On the one hand, Russian expansion in the northeast, while at the same time on the other trying to kick Russia back out of the northwest, where Uyghurs had briefly carved out a state. Each soldier, every bit of gold spent crushing Yaqub Beg in Kashgar, was a resource not able to fight Russian pressure in the northeast. This means the reconquest of Xinjiang didn't happen alone. It happened at real cost to the Qing's ability to withstand Russia elsewhere, just when Russian power in East Asia was a growing threat. The Uyghurs nearly collapsed the empire by overstretching it. This channel defends Western civilization, so why am I talking about the persecution of Uyghurs by the Chinese Communist regime, or rather the ancient roots of it, in East Asia? Things this horrific almost never happen in a vacuum, and there is a long history between Chinese and Uyghur if you want to understand it. Yes, that is fascinating, but I have a reason. I do this to raise awareness of an actual genocide. Because since October 2023, the attack on Israel, I have been attacked from my Jewish faith with a medieval blood libel of genocide, child killer, and had people who were my friends accuse me of the worst things you can imagine. Throwing around smearing words aimed at Jews in Israel defending themselves against pure evil. An evil that seeks to destroy the West and then Islamize it. And yet, the same, in quotes, progressives who take the side of these anti-Western, evil demons in Hamas and Hezbollah have said nothing about what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which is a genocide of Muslims. The very group anti-Zionists pretend to care about. Whilst the population of Palestinian Arabs has quadrupled in living memory, in a genocide the population goes down, not up. Millions of Uyghur men are held in re-education forced labor camps, with Uyghur women forced into birth control. Uyghur birth rates are down by over 60% in several areas, so that there is no next generation of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. If these anti-Zionist progressives who hate Israel hate genocide so much, why are they so silent when Muslims are genocided in China or Christian Africans in Africa? Because they don't actually hate Israel. You have to know something to hate it. They hate that nations exist. They hate nationalism of the civilized Western mold because it denies them their borderless woke utopia in which they can childishly imagine that all non-European people are good and innocent and that they have the original sin of whiteness. They see Jews as European, which most are not. And as happens during each age of history since the time of Moses in Egypt, the Jews are hated for what that age and time hates about itself. The Pharaoh hated Jews for their ingratitude of allowing them existence. And yet it was Pharaoh who had forgotten Joseph, who had saved Egypt from famine. In the West, today, progressives hate nothing more than the existence of their own nations. But these anti-Zionists who have said nothing of the Uyghur people's suffering cannot bring themselves to acknowledge their hatred of their own people. So, they hate Jews for having a nation whilst ignoring actual genocides in China and Africa. Diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, leave a comment, or donate to the channel with Buy Me a Coffee. The link is below. And we'll see you next time.